Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. I see many familiar names and faces, and I'm excited to be able to talk with you all today. We're going over an effective testimony workshop for the expansion of Coffin Butte landfill. My name is Mason Levitt. I work for Beyond Toxics. We're an environmental justice organization that is focused on uplifting community voices so that people have a right to healthy, clean, and safe air and water, and that they have an ability to be at the decision-making table for industrial facilities and other forms of pollution that affect their communities. We've been working with folks and the Valley Neighbors for Environmental Quality and Safety for about 3 years now on the Coffin Butte expansion. I'm sort of taking the place of Mark Yeager tonight, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He has typically done this presentation in the past, but he's spending the evening with his family tonight. And so I'm stepping up and sort of taking on some of his views and experiences as much as possible. And then this evening, I also have Ken Keniston joining us, who spent 20 years on the Planning Commission of Benton County, and his experience with these sorts of land use applications is deeply invaluable. And we're so grateful for the time and energy that he has spent on developing those. So you'll be hearing from him second in just a moment, and he'll also introduce himself a bit further. I'd also like to thank Emily from Beyond Toxics for being here tonight and helping run this webinar, and we really appreciate that. So getting into a little bit of etiquette and logistics. This evening, I hope you will all break out your notepads, your Post-it notes, your Word document, whatever it be, and then keep your questions on there. So write them down as they come up. I will sort of be running through this. If you want to put a short and quick clarifying question in the chat about any of our slides or content, feel free to do so, and I will do my best to address those as they come up, but we're going to keep more substantive questions towards the end. When we do our Q&A, we will be recording that as well. So if you unmute and ask a question, your voice will be a part of the recording. We are doing that because inevitably, as people watch this later, they're going to share your exact same question and want an answer as well. So it'll just be helpful for everyone involved. If you are uncomfortable with that, please put your question into the chat and I'll read it out loud so that ends up on the recording and people know what we're talking about. But that way you can preserve the anonymity of your voice if you so wish. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So as mentioned, we're going over how to give effective testimony for the expansion of Coffin Butte landfill. You can see that landfill right in front of you. This photo was actually taken about 2 years ago, so it's gotten a little bit taller since then and is more reaching the top of that mountain. The current expansion is going to be off to the left, just out of the frame of view, but there has been an acknowledgement from our public services and county officials that this is the first of a few expansions, and that likely Republic Services has the plan to fill this entire valley with a landfill from mountain face to mountain face. There's another mountain off to the left that's just kind of cropped out of view. So we are hoping that the buck stops here, and then that's kind of why we're here today is to discuss how to make sure that that's happening. So as mentioned, I'm going to be speaking on sort of behalf of Mark Yeager. Him and I have worked together for 3 years, so I'm going to replicate his views as much as possible. Mark Yeager is a retired environmental engineer. Semi-retired, I should say. He's worked for the city of Albany for a number of decades and served on Benton County's Solid Waste Advisory Committee. I am Mason. I have a bit of background in geographic information systems, cartography, and data analysis. And so Mark and I have been working closely together over the past 3 years, and Mark kindly organized this with Ken Keniston, who will speak later. So let's, without further ado, jump right into an outline. All right. So this evening, we are going to go through this accordingly. First, we are going to talk about how a conditional use permit takes place and what that means. A conditional use permit is a land use type of application in which it is acknowledged that the use of that land is going to pose likely significant burdens on surrounding land uses. So as you all can see in this photo, we have some rangeland up front. There's various houses in this area that you can't quite see in the frame, but they're on the sides and behind us. And then up in front of us, you have the current Coffin Butte landfill as it is. It is a large industrial site and holds quite a presence in the Soap Creek Valley. So you can imagine there's a lot of noise, there's pollution, and it's quite eye-catching. So it's holding a quite large presence, and for that reason, when they expand the landfill, they need to make a conditional use permit application. So we're going to discuss the process of how a CUP works. We're going to look at the immediate next steps in front of us. We're going to review what that criteria looks like, and then Ken is going to talk about what key aspects of effective testimony look like and give a few examples. So this is a map of the entire CUP process. It is quite overwhelming to look at, and do not worry, I will not be quizzing you on it later. I want you to pay attention to a couple of things though. One, where we're currently at in red, where the county is reviewing the CUP for completeness. We'll discuss this a little bit more in depth in just a second. But over here in yellow, we have a planning commission holds a public hearing. That is the point at which we are hoping and working with you all to give testimony on how that expansion is going to impact you. We ask that as you write your testimony and come up with your testimony ideas, that you save those ideas and save that writing until this public hearing happens. The reason we ask that is because it ensures that your comments and your views and your personal experiences will make it into the public record. And only at this point will it be entered into the public record. After it goes before the Planning Commission of Benton County, the Planning Commission will either approve or deny the conditional use permit. And it is all but entirely likely that the loser, so to speak, of that application will appeal that decision to the Board of Commissioners. So if the expansion is approved, it is likely that people are going to appeal that to the Board of Commissioners so that it is rejected. If the expansion is rejected, it is likely that Republic Services will appeal to the Board of Commissioners to get it approved. Beyond that, there is a chance it will go to the Land Use Board of Appeals run by the state of Oregon, but usually LUBA affirms a decision made by a local government unless there was a substantial mishap in the process and that introduced a significant problem with the way that the process unfolded. So it is likely to sort of end there, but we kind of have it on here just to sort of show you all the process of this. We'll link you all to these slides later, so if you want to look at this more in depth and ask follow-up questions about it, you're more than welcome to. But the highlights here is that the important places to get your testimony and your perspective heard are in yellow, and that we ask and encourage you to wait until those moments to submit your testimony. All right, so I'm really stepping into Mark's shoes right now. So I'm kind of running off of his slides. Oh, sorry, did that not switch? All right, so I'm really running off of Mark's shoes right now. And if he were here, he would tell you that the county has a bias in this process and that they are slated and intending to give approval to the expansion. The reason for that, he would say, is because there is a strong financial incentive for the county to approve the expansion. In the franchise agreement between Benton County and Republic Services, there is a provision which states that the county gets $1 million each year. And if an expansion is approved by the year of 2025, they will get to keep receiving that $1 million. If they don't approve an expansion, they lose out on that $1 million. So there's sort of he puts it as a financial incentive. I think it's a bit of a financial penalty for not approving the expansion. And that's kind of built into the franchise agreement. He would also tell you that it is inevitable that the staff will approve this expansion and that they will list a certain amount of conditions. As mentioned, this is what is called a conditional use permit. The idea is that if we have this substantially impactive land use in an area where other surrounding land uses like residential zoning or forestry or agriculture are going to be impacted by the presence of this landfill, the county has the ability to attach conditions to that use as to minimize those impacts to surrounding land uses. Now, Mark served on the Benton County Talks Trash Committee for 2 years, and he was assigned to a subcommittee which reviewed the conditions that have been attached to the landfill for the past 60 years. And everyone on that committee came to an agreement and acknowledged that no condition placed on the landfill in the past 60 years has ever been enforced. So conditions have never been enforced and will not likely ever be enforced. There is no staff or county staff that are monitoring or making sure that conditions are enforced. And the county has explicitly stated that unless people start complaining and drawing attention to this, that they will not do so. And in Mark's experience and many other members of Valley Neighbors of Environmental Quality and Safety, they would tell you that although they have complained, nothing has come of it. So while these conditions are meant to help mitigate those impacts, in practicality and reality, they are just not enforced and they are not given the resources to be enforced. So Mark would implore you to pay attention to these conditions, but he would also say, let's be real, they're not going to be looked at and enforced. Over here, we have a photo on the top right of a leachate truck that is being loaded with toxic sludge that comes out of the bottom of a landfill. As rain and other moisture percolate through the landfill, it picks up all sorts of fun toxics and materials that have been put in there over the last 50 years. And then that leachate is pumped out of the landfill into these trucks. I believe if I remember my numbers correctly, there are at least 11 of these a day, depending on how wet or dry it is. And all of that leachate is shipped to 2 different sewage facilities, which then dump it untreated into the Willamette River because sewage facilities are not equipped to deal with this. So there are, sorry, noise in the background. There are a number of environmental externalities that come from this and come from the presence of the landfill, and they affect more than just the surrounding area. This is a really good example of how the landfill is affecting the Willamette River and larger areas. And this becomes really important just a sec. I know most of you have attended webinars of our the past, so this might be a familiar issue, but if you'd like to learn more, we do have a previous webinar that focuses on these environmental externalities of the landfill in a lot more depth. So I encourage you to go and watch that after tonight's meeting, and you're welcome to ask any questions about it in the Q&A. So we know that these conditions are not likely to be enforced, and that holds a variety of consequences. So this is why it's so important to submit testimony. So the question is who can? And the answer is you or anybody. You do not have to be a Benton County resident. You do not have to be an Oregon resident. I don't even think you have to be a US resident. You can submit testimony on this expansion. Now, the county and Republic Services, and especially Republic Services, are trying to limit who is ostensibly impacted by the presence of the landfill. If you read their expansion proposal, which is, I can tell you, delightful, and 1,000 pages of wonderful contents, it shows a clear and concerted effort to limit the geographic area in which people are supposedly impacted by the landfill. It says people only in the very northern part of Soap Creek Valley and the very, very northern few rows of houses in Adair Village are impacted by the landfill. Now, I worked with several other people, and we actually went out and surveyed 500 homes in Adair Village. 126 of them talked to us, and they told us all the ways in which they are impacted by the landfill. And I can attest that it is not limited to the geographic area that Republic Services has put forth, and that Republic Services hasn't gone out there and conducted these surveys either. So happy to talk more about that, but there is a concerted effort to limit who is impacted, and we encourage you to not shy away from any pushback that you get as you submit your testimony. Now, there is language in the CUP that is referred to as seriously interferes. And again, this goes back to the idea that this landfill poses a burden for surrounding land uses. And that burden has to be met to seriously interferes. And you and I might disagree on what a nuisance is versus a serious interference, but I encourage you to use that language. If you live in a home out near the landfill and you are not able to host family and friends outside for dinner because it smells so terrible, that I would say is a serious interference with your use of your home and your property and your house. We have heard from a farmer who's out nearby and couldn't hire workers because the smell was so bad right next to their farm. That, we would say, is a serious interference with the use of that agricultural land. We've heard from other farmers who have been concerned about PFAS and forever chemicals landing on their farm and contaminating their soil. That is a serious interference, right? So be sure to use this language. And when people say, oh, well, that's just a nuisance, no, it's a serious interference. You have a home out there for a reason, and your home, and you are entitled to certain uses of that. So don't let the county deter you. Don't let Republic Services language deter you. Get the word out there. Okay, so where can you submit testimony? As the CUP goes through its process, it's going to go before 3 committees. One is the Environmental and Natural Resources Advisory Committee. This one's a bit tricky to pin down because we won't have very much notice for when this committee meets and talks about this issue. But you can submit testimony there if you're plugged in, and we will let you know. Later, we'll post the websites for Valley Neighbors for Environmental Quality and Safety and Beyond Toxics. On both those websites, you can sign up for email alerts, and we'll be sure to have the thumb on the pulse and let you know. The next one is the Planning Commission, and this is really the big one that is really important to get your testimony in. We'll have 14 days notice for when that Planning Commission hearing happens. And at some point, the public testimony or the public comment period will open and you'll be able to submit to there. Again, as we mentioned earlier, please wait for that public comment period to open to submit your testimony. But for all means, please start writing your testimony. There's nothing like the present. We have some time over the holidays if you're not super busy. A lot of these thoughts and issues can be fresh on our mind. So feel free to start writing. Feel free to get your ideas on paper. And especially as Ken gives his advice and his experience and lived experience on the Planning Commission, incorporate his feedback into your testimony, and that will make it extra powerful. As we've been saying, not all testimony is created equally. There are ways to make it much more impactful for planning commissioners. Okay, so once that's happened, there is a very, very real chance and good chance that it will be appealed to the Board of Commissioners. And that will be another area where you can submit the same testimony that you've already written and resubmit it for the record for them to consider. Over here is a photo of what's called the working face of Coffin Butte. The working face is where garbage is deposited daily, and hundreds of diesel trucks come up on this landfill and dump the garbage where it is compacted and spread around. And at the end of the day, it is supposed to be completely covered. This is supposed to accomplish a few different purposes. One, it's supposed to mitigate the smells. Two, it's supposed to keep wildlife out of the garbage. Three, it is supposed to prevent litter from being blown out into people's fields, backyards, homes, and the surrounding forest. Now, as you all can see, this is the way that Republic Services covers their garbage at the end of a working day. It's with a flimsy tarp, and this looks like pretty low effort to me. They're barely even covering most of the garbage. A lot of it is just sitting there. And what's a tarp going to do in terms of preventing the smell? So this is the type of thing that people are having to deal with on a daily basis. If you're smelling this all the time, it's because of these bad practices. And we talk a lot about this in our other webinars, and the EPA has found that the landfill has failed to comply with a lot of these rules that are meant to prevent smells and other odors and air pollutants from getting out. So this is your opportunity to get your concerns on the record, and please mention all of this as you do so. So when expressing your concerns, you can speak to the environmental impacts, long-term liabilities, wildlife, recreation effects, traffic, etc. By expanding the landfill, there will be much more trucks and much more waste coming in. So any problems that are currently being faced are more than likely to be exacerbated by the expansion of the landfill and the addition of a second working face. Don't be deterred. Get on the record. Someone's giving you pushback, get on the record. One of the really important things to note about the land use criteria is that it is subjective. It does give the planning commissioners the discretionary ability to review the evidence. So if you hear anybody saying otherwise, they are wrong. You can get your opinions out into the world and out onto the record, and it does not have to follow a certain set of rules. That being said, there are ways to make your testimony stronger, and we'll talk about those. And feel free to describe the community and regional and global impacts. And the theme that we really want you to remember is that this is the first expansion. There will likely be ones afterwards. We have found email exchanges between Republic Services representatives and county officials talking about future zoning changes and ways to allow for more landfills expansions in the future. The buck stops now, and this is our opportunity to say no to this expansion and any future expansions. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to Ken and have him introduce himself. And then as we go through that, we'll make it to Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nathan. You did a great job for a Mark Yeager. I heard those same biases expressed equally as well. Go ahead and give me the next slide here. I was a planning commissioner for probably over 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of testimony, and it really is important that people speak up and tell the planning commission what you're thinking, because we really we're members of the public just like you. We volunteer our time to sit on this planning commission and help represent the public's desire for what we want our community to look like and what we want to allow to happen. So I think your participation is really important, and you shouldn't think that it doesn't make a difference, because it really does. It is really hard to get people to testify for the Planning Commission, and some people have never spoke their word. They'll come to a meeting sometimes, but they'll sit silent and they'll just see what's going on. And it really is important that you do chime in and let us know what you think. There's always this issue about whether you should write your testimony down and submit it, or whether you should wait and say something to the Planning Commission at the time of the hearing. I strongly advocate you write your testimony down and submit it as part of the record. In written testimony, you have the ability to organize your thoughts, talk about your personal experience and how what happens at the landfill affects uses on your land, uses on the adjacent lands, uses and impacts in the whole community around you. And in a written testimony, in a written letter to the Planning Commission, you have time to expand on those ideas and make your case very clear and make your point. There may be an opportunity to present oral testimony at Planning Commission hearings. And it's all subject to how the Planning Commission chooses to operate the oral testimony part of the hearing. There have been times when testimony has been limited to 5 minutes or 3 minutes. Um, and it's very difficult to get all of your points across in just oral testimony. So it never hurts to give oral testimony, but try to summarize your written testimony in very concise terms and make your points to the planning commissioners at that point. You'll still need to state your name and address for the record, much like you would if you submitted written testimony. It really helps if you cite what specific criteria you're addressing in your testimony. If what's happening is some of those things are affecting the use of your property, uh, and it has a serious impact on you, definitely cite the criteria in the Benton County Development Code where it's appropriate. State your concerns, state how the proposal is going to affect you, why you oppose it, and why you think it's so significant that it shouldn't be allowed to continue. As part of the process, when a developer, anyone, comes to the county for a development proposal, the staff evaluates their proposal based on the criteria in the development code. And if there's a problem in there, they work hard to develop these conditions of approval that allow the proposal to proceed if it couldn't meet the criteria without it. So the staff, may propose some conditions of approval, um, but I think some of those conditions of approval may not work, or you can draw upon the fact that it hasn't worked in the past. The same conditions of approval might be included in the decision of the planning commission, but if it hasn't worked before, there's no guarantee that it's going to work again. An example might be the smell issues. They've had conditions of approval in some of those past approvals that said they got to cover it with soil, 6 inches of soil to trap the smells underneath it. Well, you saw from the picture, sometimes that's been merely spreading a tarp or even inadequately covering the whole area, and those things and smells get out. And so that condition of approval, although it's written in the decision document, it's not monitored, it's not enforced, and they just continue to let it slide. So it's important in your testimony that if you don't believe the conditions of approval are adequate, you should bring up why it hasn't worked in the past and not allow it to proceed on. It's not your job to change the conditions of approval to make them better. You only have a condition of approval to evaluate that's presented on the staff report. If that's ineffective, don't waste your time trying to think about ways that they can make it better, because that's not your job. It's not the planning commissioners to make that decision either. We have to evaluate the conditions of approval the way they're presented. So don't feel bad about saying that proposed condition of approval won't work this time. It hasn't worked in the past. We still have this problem. And I think that can be influential in not allowing the planning commission to accept those conditions of approval, which means that they can't meet the criteria in the development code, and they should have no problem then denying the application. So the other thing to remember is to try to make your testimony personal if you can. You should also be respectful of both the planning commissioners and your neighbors and whoever else is involved here. They're just doing the best they can. And remember that in your testimony. So let's go to the next slide. Drilling down into, there we go. there's a lot of talk about a code and criteria. The code is the rules, and it's guided um, by it's the rules and the regulations. And the development code is a thick notebook full of the rules. It covers all kinds of things. It's the legalese that says to develop this, you need to do this and this and this and this. Criteria are like the standards, it's the thresholds that have to be met to be approved. In this case, this conditional use code provision has criteria in it. And uh, here is listed 3 of those criteria that are in here. One stating that the criteria, the conditional use permit is discretionary. The other 2 right here talk about the decision to approve the conditional use must be based on a finding that the proposed use doesn't seriously interfere with the uses on adjacent property, with the character of the area, or the purpose of the zone. That's a very high standard that they have to meet. And these are this was one that we've cited in the last planning commission meeting that they could not meet because we had testimony from the public that talked about how the operation of the landfill seriously interfered with uses on those people's property, adjacent properties, and none of the conditions of approval that were proposed would take care of that serious interference. The second criteria here, the proposed use does not impose an undue burden on any public improvements. That one came into play on the last application for expansion by Republic Services when their proposal included closing Coffin Butte Road. That's a public roadway. That's what's considered a public improvement or a facility. In this application, they're not proposing to close Coffin Butte Road this time, but there are other improvements, utilities, and services provided here that are going to be affected, and you may be able to use this criteria in your arguments against expansion. On to the next one if you can. So the important things in this criteria, the serious interference, it's a discretionary decision about what serious interference is. Mason talked to how there is a thing like a nuisance. Nuisances are things that you don't really like, but you can live with them. Serious interference, in my mind, is like Mason used as an example, that the smell was so bad that it drove our family indoors. We couldn't go outside and enjoy eating on the back deck or out in the lawn. To me, that's a serious interference on a property that's zoned for residential use, and enjoying your backyard is part of that element of living in that rural residential zone. There are other, in here also you can apply this criteria on uses on adjacent property. Say you're adjacent to a forest zone that its primary purpose is for growing trees, providing habitat for wildlife. If what they're doing on that land, whether it be from the noises, from toxic emissions, from activity, if those are affecting uses on those adjacent properties, that's a violation of this criteria. Similarly, the character of the area. How has that character of that area changed over time? It started out as a rural residential, a rural countryside with trees and grass and wildlife wandering around. It certainly doesn't look like that anymore. And I think it's important that people point out how much it's changed. Republic Services is going to try to argue that but the dump has been there for 40 or 50 years. Surely this little expansion is not going to make a big difference. Well, it doesn't say in this most recent implementation of where the landfill is. We're looking at the character of the area over a long time period. This rural land is now a massive mountain of noise and smell and activity. It certainly is an imposing feature on the landscape, and I think that's a legitimate um, impact that you should draw attention to under this criteria. Um, I recreate a lot. I may not live right adjacent to the landfill, but I go out to E. Wilson and walk and hike and listen to birds. And anymore when you walk out there, the noises coming from the landfill uh, interfere with the quiet of nature. I'm sure it's having an effect on wildlife that's out there. And it's no longer a destination that you necessarily enjoy going out there to enjoy. And to me, that is seriously interfering with that character of the area and and the purpose of those open space zones. So I think you should, in your testimony, look at these criteria and uh, and address the ones that you think that affect you or affect that neighborhood. Uh, uh, and, uh, and I think it can make an impact to the planning commissioners. There are other, let's go to the next one too. The second half of that, oh, this is the more of the same first criteria. Go to the next one. The second one here has to do imposing an undue burden on any public improvements, facilities, and utilities on the services area. Under this criteria, I am concerned that we're putting an undue burden on things like the Willamette River. I'm a recreationalist. I go out and I swim in the Willamette. I fish there. I boat all the time. The toxic leachate that's being released into the Willamette from the distribution of the leachate, I think, is putting a burden on the Willamette River to support wildlife. It's affecting my ability to go swimming in this toxic soup that's released there by Republic Services via Corvallis, the city of Corvallis wastewater treatment program. I also think of the airshed around this area as being a public facility. If the methane emissions are causing climate changes, both locally and on the larger geographic area in, inclusive, then I think we're putting an undue burden on the airshed to supply us with clean air. And I think that there is all kinds of things in the previous testimony at the last hearing that I think are pretty alarming. We had testimony from residents in the area that said there's been an unusually high cluster of cancer problems in the Soap Creek Valley, that we don't know where the smoking gun is that caused those problems, but it doesn't mean it could not be just the air quality, the pour out quality that's coming from the Coffin Butte landfill. So just with these two criteria in this conditional use criteria in this code, I think there's plenty of room for us to write our testimony and address plenty of them. But we don't have to be limited to just these two criteria. In the Planning Commission hearing, there's a statement that's usually made that is read at the beginning of the hearing that states that the decision to approve a conditional use permit shall be based on findings that number 1 and 2 that I just talked about. But it also says at the commencement of this quasi judicial hearing, presentation shall be made to those in attendance that states that testimony and evidence must be directed towards the applicable substantive criteria or other criteria in the plan or development code which the person believes to apply to the decision. So to me, that's what that says is if you have concerns that you can't seem to pigeonhole into either of these criteria, I think it's fair game for you to write testimony and say, I think this violates something for a reason. If it's important to you, state why you think it is. At the end of the hearing or at the end of this presentation, there'll be a couple of other set of examples that I wrote up as an example that you might tailor some of your testimony for. And I deliberately put in some examples that cite some of the other criteria that you think are important. I drew upon things like the Benton, let's see if I get that to focus. Maybe I won't. Anyhow, I drew upon the comprehensive plan. There are policies in the comprehensive plan that that say Benton County is going to ensure good water quality in the Willamette River for our uses. In some of those examples, I cited some of those comprehensive plan policies and said, with the leachate releases in the Willamette River, this seems to violate some of our policies in our comprehensive plan. If your testimony says something similar to that, it tells the Planning Commission that this is a criteria that I think is important, and here is how the operation of the landfill is interfering with that. So, so I think that there is plenty of room for you to write some concerns and expand upon it and say why you think that's an important element to consider here in this decision, and write things as much as you want. I should try to there is an awful lot of jargon that goes on in here. Sometimes I refer to things about regulations in the code, the development code. It's a 200-page document that has lots of rules and regulations. There is a plan, a comprehensive plan for Benton County that has lots of policies. The county has attempted to take all of those policies in the comprehensive plan and write very specific development code rules and regulations to address those policies. But in our own self-examination of that, we have routinely found policies in the comprehensive plan that we claim are important, but yet we don't have a development code policy specifically written to address it. I think the comprehensive plan is fair game to bring up when you have concerns. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, here's some samples that I put together for some of these. I'd say write your testimony somewhat similarly. Tell us what's happening that you know about, and I would cite the specific criteria that applies to this example. There's one here that deal with farming and the impact of the landfill. It's citing a code criteria that's a conditional use criteria in the EFU zone, the agricultural land zone. Here's another one on the bottom that is impacting the character or addressing the character of the area and how, you know, things have changed from when I started visiting the area. And to me, it reflects a huge change in the character of the area. So, you know, write your examples, and if you can, cite the criteria that you have for it. Go to the next one too. Here's a couple of more that 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 do the same thing. They note the um, the concern you have, where it falls within the code criteria. Here, I didn't cite the specific carry, but you certainly can do that. Let's go to the next one. So I think that there's a whole suite of things that that you can address in your testimony to the Planning Commission or the Board of Commissioners. I think you can cite the air and water pollution. I think we're fair game to cite climate impacts because we know the methane releases that are coming from there are causing us to be able to notice it. We can talk about the noise, odor, and fire hazards. With this expansion, there's going to be increased traffic. There's going to be increased litter. Certainly, there's going to be wildlife impacts as the new area is opened up. It's going to move deer that might move through that area from doing that again. There's some other things that I'm not yet quite sure how to phrase in some samples. Community image, future employment, housing. I think a big one here are long-term liabilities that I think it would be crazy not to address. And I don't think you have to be a neighbor around Coffin Butte to be able to make your testimony and talk about the things that are affecting you as a member of the broader community. Smells, we know, go much further than the nearby residences. We know the air quality is being affected much broader than just right around Coffin Butte. And I think the pollution that's going into the Willamette River really should be addressed. We need to stop that. And I'm actually sad that some of our environmental quality organizations in the state aren't taking as much of an active role at stopping the practice. So let's go to the next slide. So in summary, make it easy for the Planning Commission to see how your comments address criteria. Talk about how it seriously interferes with the uses on your property and in your community. Explain how the proposed conditions of approval don't fix the problems. And you can cite historical examples of where it hasn't worked in the past. Why do we think it's going to fix it this time? I think you should rely on submitting your written testimony, clearly organized. And if you want, provide the oral summary of written comments during the public hearing. If you've done a comprehensive job of listing all of your concerns and your stories to go with it, it'll be a long oral testimony, but I think it'll be a challenge to pare it down. But that's kind of the way to work on that. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll let you take over, Mason, but as we mentioned, here are the things that you need to kind of get doing. Get started on your testimony now because it's going to be far too short of a comment period for us to get everything in, and they'll be under a time crunch to get it done.
So yes, as you mentioned earlier, get prepared now. Review the application documents if you so wish. Think about your concerns. Get people involved. We have another testimony workshop at the Officers Club near Adair Village on January 2nd this upcoming year. So get them to attend there. We can put some details on that in the chat in just a second. One strategy that I know Ken mentioned at our last effective testimony workshop, feel free to create multiple little testimonies, each about a different criteria and detail and concern that you have. Make it in bite-sized and easy to digest chunks. Often planning commissioners have a very short amount of time to go over these, or they're going over them in real time during the meeting. So having them with the criteria up front, the issue, and then supporting evidence below makes it really easy to take it all in. And demand a new way forward. So let's remember that waste management is a really complicated and messy issue. And There are many solutions to addressing it. I'd be happy to talk about some of our state legislation that Beyond Toxics is supporting this year. But this is our moment to demand a new way forward by saying no more expansions without better waste management as a whole, and ask the county for that. We may not solve it inside of this planning commission hearing, but this is the time to say no to the status quo and how it's affecting people. I know if you go to coffinbuttefacts.org, which is VNex's website, you can get a yard sign. So there's plenty of ways to get involved and do something about it now, whether in preparation for testimony or the broader campaign. So, and then this, I know Mark wanted to end with a video. We were out here in July. I think this was like the 25th, and it was a random day, and Mark, a couple of other Beyond Toxic staff, and VNex people had organized a tour for legislators and media representatives. And we happened to go out to Coffin Butte and see this happening. Oh, sorry. And in the video, you can clearly see trucks dumping their waste and all of the particulate matter from that waste spreading and getting off site and everywhere across the Soap Creek Valley. And this again was a random day. We didn't know that this was going to happen. And what we know is that this is a violation of Coffin Butte's air quality permit, or at least we think. They're supposed to have dust suppression technology that prevents this particulate matter from getting off site and into the neighborhood. And yet it wasn't in operation that day, and they were dumping this waste anyways, and it was getting everywhere. So remember and think about these things as you're thinking about your testimony and articulating these. And it's up to us to chart a way forward for the broader community and Benton County and rely on us working together to do that. And I think that's how Mark would have appreciated us ending things. So with that being said, I imagine there are lots of questions. You are more than welcome to raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question, or please feel free to put it in chat and I will do my best to moderate here. I know we had a couple early on, and so I think Ken is best equipped to do this, but somebody asked, are photos admissible as evidence to the Planning Commission?
Thank you very much. Yes, they definitely are admitted as evidence, and sometimes a photo can say 1,000 words. So when you go to the Planning Commission and submit your written testimony, if you really want to show it to the Planning Commission, the photos will have to be handed to the staff's recorder that's in attendance there, marked as evidence, and then they'll be moved around the table for the planning commissioners to see. It's not as it's a good way of showing them some photos, but it will be submitted as evidence, so you may not get the photos back. But what you really want to do is have a glaring photo that the planning commissioners can see to make your point. And if you want to make photocopies, they may not turn as well, but if you submit your written testimony, the recorder will take it, copies will be made and distributed to each of the planning commissioners, but it probably won't show up there that night. So that would be the value of a summary of what's on your written testimony, but what you submit in evidence is going to stay there until they can make copies of it to give to the planning commissioners. There's another question here. Is it fair to address the $1 million per year and juxtapose it with all that's lost in production from farms? I don't think it should be a one or the other thing, but I think if there's lost production in farms and orchards and recreation and livability because of the operations of the landfill, to me, I think that's something that stands on its own. And I don't think the money involved should come into the decision. It should be whether or not the operation of the landfill is causing a serious interference with the use of the property or the character of the zone or a undue burden on public facilities. So, to me, I don't know that it should come down to juggling. Should I take the $1 million, or should we have a better quality of life? Better quality of life is what we should all be going for. Another question is, how do we learn the conditions Benton County staff will propose? We won't learn those until the staff has a chance to produce a staff report and we see it in writing. After they accept the application from Republic Services, the planning consultant group is going to take all of those things and produce a staff report. In the past, the planning staff has always been the ones to produce these conditions of approval to include in the staff report. I know in the application that Republic Services submitted earlier, they took a stab at writing some of those conditions of approval. And I wouldn't be surprised how biased those might have been. So I don't know if the planning staff will, or the planning consultant will accept those draft conditions of approval as they are, or if they'll rework them and do a more balanced approach. And some of that may be impacted by the testimony you get in before the public hearing and how much they may modify the staff report. So let's see. And there's a question here about what is meant by the plan. That was the comprehensive plan I was referring to. The code is usually being referred to as the development code, this big document. And in almost all of the jargon that floats around, they talk about meeting the regulations in the code, and that's kind of short for the development code. This is
Hi, Laura. Sorry, I saw a
good.
question in the chat that says, I'm concerned about groundwater pollution and air pollution, but I have no proof that they are happening or how widespread. How can I testify about this? Well, we'll link you again to our webinar in which we go into a lot more depth about these issues, and you're welcome to watch that. And we present a lot of evidence to show that this is happening at a widespread scale. So you can watch that and understand it better. We do know that the EPA has inspected Coffin Butte and that they are failing to meet regulatory requirements for air pollution. So that is a fact, and we do know that that is happening in an issue. And in the webinar, we have a hydrogeologist by the name of Joel Geyer talk in depth about groundwater quality and the things that are happening there and the concerns that are happening there. So please refer to those resources, and you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you want to chat about any of these anymore, and it can help bring you up to speed as much as I can.
I'll also chime in, and we hear this. We hear the public when they come up and give testimony. They'll ask us questions like this, but the Planning Commission usually doesn't know some of that information, nor will they be able to recite what they have for proof to you. So it's although you're always allowed to ask a question, if it was me, I wouldn't expect to get an answer. It just is the way it is. They don't respond to questions unless it's a quick answer, and because they don't want to get into a discussion at the time. And then and in that question about the groundwater pollution and air pollution, I'm also going to suggest that there are concepts in environmental decision making by one of the professors here in Corvallis, Dave Bella, and he was he brought up a very appropriate statement that you want to try to avoid the irreversible negative consequences of an action. And, he used an example of setting off an atomic bomb. It's something that's going to be irreversible. It's going to cause all kinds of bad consequences. I look at some of these issues about groundwater pollution and air pollution being the same kind of issue. We should be trying to avoid those um, irreversible negative consequences of some of our actions. And we may not have a good smoking gun about widespread groundwater pollution, but we don't want to get the groundwater polluted because we're not going to be able to fix it. So we should be avoiding those kinds of things at all costs. And I think that's a legitimate concern to bring up to as a concept to the planning commissioners and make them feel much more receptive to trying to avoid that problem in the first place. Is there any leaches getting into our water source? I couldn't tell you that. Somebody else might be able to. See if I can find anything else. I can't read any of the other ones that are down. Is there any data we can access? Yep, I think that's all been answered. Any other questions that we can see what we can chew on? Or new messages. Property taxes. I like that property tax issue. I heard rumors that there was some people going to try to address that loss of land value thing, get some realtors involved, but I haven't seen anything specifically.
And there is a question about how would one address plastic pollution within the criteria?
How do we address that? I think that might be outside the bounds of this proposal, but to point to the problem of the increased amount of things that could have been, well, again, this might not be the right venue to talk about how we should be changing dealing with our waste stream, enhanced recycling programs, or, that seems beyond what this expansion proposal can address. And let's see, what's the one right above here? I have over 20 years dealing with public service. I have a couple of comments about how we've taken on these landfill fights over there. Have to speak if called upon. I can't see your name there, but if you are really there and can chime in, I'm not sure if that's going to help us tailor some of our testimony here or not. I think I'm not being able to move through the chat like I'd like to be able to. Leachate. Yeah. I think the person in the chat says, yeah, we're not sure where to find it in the criteria. The expanses of plan. So, those are, again, I'd say strive to address the criteria with your concerns. Make it easy for the planning commission to find the bits of testimony that's going to help them find findings of fact to deny the application. That's the key here. Make it easy with the words that you use in your testimony, address the criteria so that they can say, we've received testimony that these many people or and they could even leave it nebulous, but there's a lot of people that are expressing that there's a serious interference with their uses on their property and on adjacent properties. We've been changing the character of the area for a long time, and it's just completely different than what it was. Use the testimony to make it easy for the planning commissioners to do their job for you, because um, uh, that's what they're doing, is they want to represent you against the applicant if indeed you believe the approval of this expansion is going to really affect your ability to use your property or the adjacent people's property or the properties or in the facilities that we have available in our area. So make it easy for them. I can tell you things not to bring up. I think the issues about where the waste comes from and the fact that so little of it comes from Benton County, it's not a starter. It's not up to the planning commission to do any restrictions on where the garbage can come from. It's a private facility. They can bring as much garbage in as they're allowed. And that's where this expansion proposal is very important. Right now, we have a cap on how much can come in. If we give them this expansion, and it may only be a little one, a little area, but it opens up the door for them to remove the cap on how much trash they can bring in. And then we'll get more and more and more. And that landfill is going to fill up a heck of a lot faster than it is right now. So we need to stop this expansion proposal at this point. Otherwise, it's going to be a never ending push to fill that whole valley up, and it'll fill up fast. And Republic Services will still come back and say, "Oh, but we're running out of room. We're going to need to do something with it." I'm advocating we should just say no, and force us into doing something different. And so, anyhow, that's my 2 cents.
All right, I think we have another question from a Ken in the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, am I unmuted?
Yes, you
Yes.
are.
Okay, great. Mostly, I just wanted to open up this voice channel so people don't have to make it hard for Ken to read the chat there. I also am responding, same as Debbie. Chuck Stiles volunteered to talk a little bit about dealing with Republic, and I would like to hear what he said. But to answer kind of some of the questions that are going around, Ken, your from your talk, it seems really important to me to take a look at the comprehensive plan and look for criteria in there, opportunities in there to make our own particular concerns relevant, right? Because there's going to be something in there saying, hey, we don't want to pollute land for the next 10,000 years. And that's kind of what you're doing with plastics, for example, or a lot of the others. And I think there's also arguments in there about providing security, a sense of security for citizens. And I wanted to kind of address the questions about, well, do we know that there's pollution? To me, the question is exactly reversible. Do we know that there's not pollution? So the applicant should be saying, hey, we have evidence that there's not pollution, that we're not affecting groundwater, et cetera. But as Mason pointed out, we have contradictory evidence saying, well, no, they don't actually know that. I'll just say from my own studies of the landfill, there's an awful lot that we don't know about how much methane is coming out of it, how much is going into groundwater, what is happening with the trash that blows off of it, kind of all of these questions. And really, we should not be moving ahead with something like that. It should not be approved if we don't know. Okay, my rant is over. I want to turn it over to Chuck.
Oh, okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. This is Chuck Stiles. I am the solid waste director for the Teamsters Union. We currently represent about 7,000 Republic members. This is a very vicious company you're dealing with. I was looking on the dust as you're talking about on the cover. they're supposed to cover with. I will tell everybody on this call, it's not uncommon to see asbestos dumped into a landfill. And you have that same type of dust with asbestos dust flying all through the atmosphere. That's number one. Number two, talking about the groundwater, what you will see, uh, I won't. Some of us there you'll never see it in your lifetime, but your children and grandchildren will. These landfills, when they're finally put out of service, and with this, when they will start importing, undoubtedly that is the reason they want expansion. Is this will become an importing landfill, probably from Northern California. I would think. Maybe out of Seattle in that area, but you'll start importing more and more trash. But what happens? 30 years is the life is all that these companies cover these landfills for after 30 years. After that, when all of this seeps into the groundwater, if it's not seeping already, well, the taxpayers are on the bill for it. There is insurance out there that would have Republic where they would have to cover this for well over 100 years. It is so expensive because they know what the cost is. Due to these landfills leaking, there is no way in hell that they are going to insure their own landfill. Okay, I can tell you, it's going to be left up to you folks. You are going to pick the bill up for this. And then somebody spoke on cancer. There was a type of cancer I did not even know existed. It's called appendix cancer. In 2000, and I forget when I saw this, but we did have these folks up that live near a landfill, and some of you may be aware of it outside of St. Louis. Worldwide, there's usually in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 cases of appendix cancer in the world. Around the Coldwater Creek landfill outside of St. Louis, the folks within a mile vicinity of that landfill had 11 cases of appendix cancer in their children. So, this thing is really just a ticking time bomb. As you said, I think a minute ago, it is like a nuclear bomb. We don't know what's going to happen. We do know what's going to happen with the Republic. This will be, and I think you spoke to that earlier, this will become a much bigger nightmare than it is now. That's the only reason they're asking for the expansion is so they can import this. This company will tell you one thing drives them, and that's their bottom line. That is giving money back to the shareholders. That is their own concern. None of the rest of this stuff concerns them. We have a full research department. Matter of fact, one of our researchers is on this call, New Promoti, but we can get that information to you. But I don't see anybody I don't know of any executive from Republic lives near one of their landfills. I'll say you that. So I'll close with that. But thank you guys for letting me call, and we'll be glad to help in any way we're called upon.
Thank you very much,
Chuck.
Chuck. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll really quickly just add there's a provision in the franchise agreement between Benton County and Republic Services that says Republic Services may cancel their pollution liability insurance with 30 days notice if they decide it becomes too expensive for them to pay for. So to Chuck's point, that liability insurance can go away at a moment's notice, and it is totally up to Republic to end that provision. All right. I think we have reached the end of questions. We are happy to share Ken's and I's contact information. And Mark, Ken from the audience has another question.
I do, just a quick one. Oh, crap, now I'm just forgetting what. Oh, I wanted to just say to everyone that, this expansion is supposed to increase the life of the landfill for 6 more years. So anything that is going wrong with the landfill right now, the harm is it will be 6 years longer. There'll be 6 years more of it. It doesn't necessarily have to prove that there's going to be a bump, in the next few years or whatever. The harm comes with 6 more years of operation of the landfill, which is 6 more years of the landfill not being closed, not being covered, not being sealed, not, suspending operations, etc. So that is a point that people can make in their testimony, is to just say 6 more years of that, no thank you.
I like it. Ken, do you have any concluding thoughts?
Again, I'm always impressed by this group of people that takes issue here with the